is, can you tell us about the current situation in Gaza, the humanitarian situation? What hospitals are still functional, not functional, the kind of medical help people are still able to get? How are people be able to get out? How is aid getting in? And what news that is not shared on media outlets? Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for your invitation, and thank you to the audience for taking the time to really participate in this. First of all, I want to say about Taawon. One of my most favorite writers, an African-American writer by the name of Audre Lorde, once wrote, "The master's tools will never bring down the master's house." And it is really that call for us to develop our own tools, our own, and as I said after the war, our own International Committee of the Red Cross, and our own Arab Health Organization, and our own Arab Food Organization. And Taawon is really one of our tools. This is a purely Palestinian Arab funding organization, which means that the agenda for funding projects that it sets are Palestinian agendas, and the priorities that it puts for its funding rounds are Palestinian priorities, fed to it by its teams on the ground and by decades of experience in working with people on the ground in Palestine, not just in Gaza, but in Jerusalem and in the West Bank. So for me, Welfare Association occupies a critical role as being one of the tools of the Palestinian people that Audre Lorde talked about. The current situation is as such. The health system has been completely destroyed. If we go from the north down to the far south, in the north, there is very sporadic, and I mean very sporadic, whenever the UN manages to get some anesthetic medication. There's a single operating room that's functioning in a hospital in Jabalia camp that's operated intermittently when there's medication, and another operating room in Ahli Baptist Hospital in Gaza City that operates intermittently whenever the UN manages to get supplies through so that they can run this these cases. And that's it. 600,000 people still living in the northern part of Gaza have access to these two operating rooms and these two partially destroyed hospitals. Everything else has been completely demolished. When we move to the south, the attacks on hospitals and the way Israel has neutralized the hospitals in multiple ways, sometimes without even needing to attack them. So if you, I'll give you an example, what happened at the beginning of last month at Al-Aqsa Hospital in Deir al-Balah. The Israelis would find a building that's close to or adjacent to the hospital. They then bomb that building with a disproportionately large bomb, not with just the aim of destroying that building, but with having the destruction spill over onto the hospital, which would be damaged inadvertently without being targeted. The other thing that it did, and I remember seeing it in Ahli Hospital, but now is a regular occurrence in Khan Yunis and in Deir al-Balah, is the use of quadcopter drones. These are drones that have a sniper gun attached to them. Drones would be sent to the vicinity of the hospital, firing at any of the patients trying to make their way to the hospital. And so, although the hospital would not be targeted itself, the patients trying to get to it would be prevented with risk of death from getting to that hospital. The hospital in in the south, Israel has attacked, surrounded, and evacuated all of the hospitals in the south, with the exception now of the European hospital in Rafah, which today has started being attacked by Israeli tanks and is really the last remaining hospital in the whole of the Gaza Strip. And so we are currently talking about 2.25 million people with access to only 9 operating rooms. These 9 operating rooms, as of today, are under threat. When we look at the public health picture as a whole, Israel is not just part of its genocidal war wanting to kill people with bombs and bullets and blast injuries. Israel has also, through the destruction of the health system, ensured that a lot of the wounded die from their wounds because they cannot access the health system, but also has created what we call the perfect storm of public health catastrophe. When you destroy 60 to 70% of people's homes, forcing them into overcrowded schools that were built to house 1,000 students and now have tens of thousands of inhabitants, you then destroy the water and sewage system, and you, through the siege, induce a level of malnutrition that now the UN is starting to set up feeding stations like the ones we used to see in Africa during the famine. That triangle means that you are setting people up for infectious diseases epidemics to kill them. In the harsh winter month, children who are malnourished, who are wounded, and who live in exposed areas will die of hypothermia in the temperatures of 7 and 8 degrees that we have at night in Gaza these days. And so a 3-track genocidal approach by the Israelis in order to maximize the number of people being killed is taking place at the moment. And there's no sign that it's slowing down, because it doesn't need to slow down. The world has seen it coming. The International Court of Justice has identified this as a genocidal war, and we have had nothing as a response from Western powers other than an attempt to smear UNRWA and blackmail the Palestinian people by cutting off the last humanitarian organization able to stop this impending famine from killing the rest of the population. There was an article in The Lancet, one of the world's leading medical journals, that expected 1/4 of the population of Gaza to die as a result of these epidemics and this malnutrition if the war were to continue on in this. Now, if we want to look deeper behind the number, then you start seeing the layers of the absolute catastrophe that the numbers don't tell you. We currently know that there are around 30,000 registered deaths as a result of this war. But actually, this number constitutes probably 40% of the total number of people who have been killed. The rest are buried under the rubble in buildings that have no, Gaza has no heavy lifting equipment to try to recover any of these bodies. And even back when I was in Gaza in October and November, we were starting to, in some buildings, you could smell the decaying and decomposing bodies. So that group is around 10 to 15,000. And these are people who have been reported missing by relatives and known to be under the rubble. There's then another group that is as a result of something very particular to this genocidal war, which is the fact that Israel has been taking out complete neighborhoods all at once when it drops, between 7 and 9 2,000-pound bombs on a single neighborhood. And so what happens in Gaza, as in a lot of parts of the Arab world, neighborhoods have concentrations of large families or clans. And so when you take out the whole neighborhood where the Hamula or the clan live, there is no one to report those buried under the rubble as missing, because the whole clan and the whole extended families, actually multiple layers of extended families, are being wiped out. And then we have the last horrific missing part of those dead, is that when you do drop a 2,000-pound bomb, almost a ton and a half, there are certain people who are pulverized, who by the sheer size of the bomb, there is no physical remains that are left once this bomb explodes in these buildings. We start then looking at the wounded. Currently, there are around 60,000 wounded. 30,000 of these wounded are children. We know from the medical literature that a war-wounded child will need between 8 and 12 surgeries by the time they reach adult age. So if you do the math and multiply 8 to 12 times the 30,000, you can see the kind of burden of care that will be there for the next decade or so in treating these wounded. Of these 30,000 wounded children, 6,000, between 5 and 6,000 have lost limbs and have had amputations. And so these children, we know from the medical literature that they will require a new prosthetic every 6 months, because as the child grows, the prosthetic limb needs to be changed, and have also between 9 and 10 surgeries by the time they're of adult age, just to the amputated limb. Before the war, there were around 180 of these conflict-related amputations in children in Gaza. So you can see that even before the Israelis destroyed Hamad Hospital, which was the prosthetic center for children in Gaza, the increase and the scale of this tsunami of children with limb amputations, never seen in the history of wars, not even in the 20th century, is beyond the capacity of the health system in Gaza to cope with. We then look at the social damage or the social wounding that is happening to both the wounded and the children who are not physically wounded. And that is the loss of one or both parents. And this is compounded usually by the fact that this loss happened in the home. And so this loss is associated with the loss of the house. And so we are getting children, around 20,000 children, as Abir said, who have lost one or both parents, almost all of whom have lost their homes, many of whom have lost both parents and extended families. And I remember when we were at Shifa, we were noticing this phenomena of wounded children with no surviving relatives. And there were around 120 of them. And these had no distant cousins from either side of the family left when they were taken out of the rubble. And so the complexity of the challenge that is going to face the Welfare Association in running its and upscaling its orphan sponsorship program is really mammoth, and is going to require an organization that is within Palestinian society, because of the sensitivity of the issue, at hand. These are the children of martyrs. These are kids whose parents were killed as a way of ethnically cleansing what remained of Palestine. And so it's critical that Palestinian institutions oversee, if not deliver, the care that these children need to ensure that their care is not part of the ethnic cleansing aims of the war, but actually that they're cared for as much as possible within Gaza and as much as possible within extended families, and that these extended families are supported. Unfortunately, a lot of these children, orphan children, are either wounded, as I said, or that their carers are wounded. And so this program will need to be sufficiently nuanced and individually targeted so that each child's specific needs are met, because the layers of social destruction are going to be different for each of these children. In order to try to rebuild the lives of these wounded children, some of whom have been orphaned, one of the things that we're trying to do is we set up a fund to try to take some of these wounded children to Lebanon for complex reconstructive surgery. And the question that is asked immediately is, why Lebanon and why in this current situation? Even within the subspecialty trauma reconstruction, war injuries constitute a complex and difficult disease load to deal with. And in a lot of ways, it is not usually the expertise needed to provide proper care for these children surgically doesn't exist everywhere, particularly outside the realm of military medicine. Unfortunately, by the very nature of the history of the health system in Lebanon, not just from the Civil War and the 82 invasion and the 2006 war, but by virtue of the fact that Lebanon then became a regional hub for a lot of the wounded that were coming from Iraq and from the war in Syria. The level of expertise in dealing with these complex war injuries in children exists in Lebanon, and it rarely exists anywhere else, including Europe and North America. Civilian trauma surgeons are not used to seeing children with blast injuries. Civilian trauma surgeons are not used to seeing children shot with high velocity sniper bullets. And so one of the main aims of this project is really to take these kids to Lebanon to give them the best opportunity for reconstructive surgery, for rehabilitation. And because these processes are complex and staged, so the child will need several surgeries, usually with a gap of 2 months or 3 months between them, it is critical that the treatment and the treatment pathway is a holistic pathway. These kids have not just been physically wounded, they have been socially wounded, and they have been psychologically wounded. And therefore, the aim of this foundation is to provide that holistic treatment that includes surgery, but is not purely surgical in nature. These children need surgeries, but they don't just need surgeries. They need psychosocial support. They have been out of school for a year while they're undergoing their treatment. In between the treatment process, they need to have homeschooling. They need to feel alive again. They need to feel like children again. And the idea is that we believe in the foundation that we can provide that kind of holistic care in Lebanon, because the infrastructure, the experience, and the expertise exists in Lebanon. And so between us, between every organization working in the humanitarian field, and particularly Arab and Palestinian organizations. We need to ensure that the primary aim of the war is not achieved, that people are given the chance to return to Gaza, to stay in Gaza, and to rebuild their lives in Gaza. And Israel's aims of ethnically cleansing Gaza, which it failed so far to do in the war, it fails to do in the ceasefire. And we know that Israel always tries to achieve in a ceasefire what it's failed to achieve in the war. It will attempt to hamper reconstruction. It will attempt to hamper the treatment of patients. It will attempt to stop the rebuilding and the rehabilitation of the health system, so that those who have decided to stay eventually lose faith and go outside Gaza, at least for the sake of their children. And that's why, for me, the foundation concentrates on children. Because as a parent, I know that there are things that I would do for my children that I would not do for myself. And so if we enable these families to feel that we are there for them and their children in their time of need, then we will be able to help them stay in Gaza. I think I'll leave it there, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you want.
There's a question I have, and I got a lot of, is the aid. How is aid able to enter? And there's also a lot on the issue that a lot of things that are being removed from the trucks, like insulin pens, oxygen tanks. Can you elaborate on that a little? Because that makes it very hard for diabetes patients and other kinds of patients to survive.
So unfortunately, what is going in is a trickle of the trucks. You know, Gaza used to have around 800 to 1,000 trucks go in. I think Gaza now, on a daily basis, only a couple of hundred are allowed in. A few days ago, the Ministry of Health said that actually only 30% of the contents of medical aid is of use and is what the ministry had asked for, and that, as awful as it sounds, the ministry is still receiving COVID-related aid, PCR sets, isolation kits, as a medical aid for the war wounded. And so you can imagine that this trickle of aid that's currently going in only aims to basically camouflage the totality of the siege that's being imposed on Gaza. Not enough aid is getting to the south to make any kind of difference to the health system, and no aid is getting to the north. And we've seen how Israel bombed one of the UN trucks trying to get to the north the other day. Israel then has created the list. And what is bizarre is that the Western powers and regional powers do not question anything that Israel does or says. So the Israeli veto on what goes in and out includes what they call the list of dual use items. And Israel now includes solar panels, dual use, oxygen concentrators as dual use, EpiPens as dual use, insulin pens as dual use, the rods that keep the tents up as dual use. So anything that Israel feels can hamper the aid process and can hasten the death of more Palestinians, it's adding to the dual use list.
Okay. What is the psychological and emotional impact? I'm sure it's beyond anything we can fathom. And how can mental health support be integrated into the recovery process? Because this is something that maybe we think of just aid and stuff, but this is something that is beyond crucial at this point, especially
Absolutely.
maybe children.
The horrors that have been visited on people in Gaza are beyond what we can imagine. The loss, the multiple loss, the grief, the fear that they have been put through over the last 120 days is beyond anything anybody can imagine. The problem is that all mental health interventions rely on the idea of post-traumatic aid, but we're not in the post-trauma part yet. And that everyone, all 2,300,000 or people in Gaza have been injured in terms of their mental health, and have seen things that shouldn't be seen, have lost loved ones. So for us, when we designed this foundation and the treatment path, that's why we integrated the psychosocial support for both the child and the adults accompanying, so that from the very beginning, so that the healing that happens for the physical wounds is also accompanied by an attempt to heal the mental health wounds and the social wounds at the same time.
During a talk you gave at the IPS, the Institute for Palestinian Studies, you talked about the social resistance of the people of Gaza. Can you elaborate more about that here?
So what we have seen from the very beginning of the war, how people have survived by completely relying on the kindness and the solidarity of others. You know, when these houses that are bombed have 50 people in them, multiple families, some of whom have very small connections. They're not all blood relatives. Some of them are just friends. People take in other families into their homes. They share their food. They look after each other. These orphan children are immediately looked after by the families of other wounded children in the hospital. That kind of community solidarity, that kind of dissolution of the individual into what benefits the group, and that the group then starts behaving as one in order to survive and in order to provide for all of its members, is what has prevented. It's hard to think that things could have been worse, but I believe things could have been much worse had the response of Palestinian society in Gaza not been that magnanimous and that generous and that gracious, and that people had decided to fight this death, this world of death that Israel had tried to create in Gaza by these acts of selfless love, not just towards their kin, but towards everybody around them, and sometimes towards complete strangers. We have been listening to the story of the girl whose family were killed, and she was left in the car while being targeted. Nothing in the world could have made those ambulance paramedics go under fire to try to save her, but they did. And it's these acts of selflessness and these acts of pure dedication and love that are the untold story of this death and destruction. The way common, ordinary Palestinians have resisted death through acts of great love and great generosity.
Can you please elaborate on the ongoing efforts and challenges in the reconstruction of Gaza, especially after the huge physical damage to the infrastructure? I know that you are in Amman and you just attended the reconstruction of Gaza exhibit or
It's a conference.
conference.
Yeah. So I think once there is a ceasefire, there's going to be a need for rapid introduction of modular homes and modular buildings to try to compensate for the 60 to 70% of homes that have been destroyed. In addition, we will need field hospitals to allow the health system to provide services while the damaged and destroyed hospitals have been refurbished, repaired, or rebuilt. That is what I mean by when I say that Israel will try to achieve what it, in the ceasefire, what it failed to achieve in the war, through preventing these kinds of homes, through these kinds of modular buildings, by keeping people living in these schools and in the rubble of their homes. Israel is going to attempt to keep in a protracted period of devastation and loss.
The question that is coming up about the fund, about the Ghassan Abu Sittah's Children Fund, is once children are treated and rehabilitated in Lebanon, is there a guaranteed mechanism in place for their safe and permanent return to Gaza?
So the idea is, when we look at the trauma pathway, it doesn't just end at rehabilitation. It actually ends at reintegration. And so part of the foundation's job is to try to forge links back in Gaza to ensure not just medical follow-up for these children, but a mechanism by which we help these families rebuild their lives. At no stage will we be sending kids back to Rafah and then throwing them back into Gaza in social conditions where they've lost their homes, they've lost their families. There is no source of income. So the idea will be that these kids, when as part, so what happens is that the foundation will be composed of a medical committee, a medical advisory committee that plans the medical part of the treatment. There will also be a team of social workers that will plan this, not just the psychosocial treatment, but also start working on forging links and planning the reintegration of these children and their families to come over. These families to be able to go back to Gaza and reintegrate. And so there's no kind of dumping process where they fall off the cliff once their medical needs. Treatment ends not at rehabilitation, but at reintegration.
Are doctors from foreign countries allowed to enter Gaza? And if yes, through which organization can this be facilitated, and how can people help?
So doctors have been allowed. The doctors that have been allowed constitute 10% of the total number of doctors that have applied. Israel still has the veto to vet and decide who goes in and who comes out. The UK organizations are Medical Aid for Palestinians, Ideals, which does limb reconstruction. I think International Medical Relief is doing care. But certainly with regards to surgeries, the problem that exists at the moment is not, the shortage of doctors is not the limiting factor. The limiting factor at the moment is that the system has been so degraded that even if you send more doctors, they're not going to be able to provide more services. If they're all the surgeons, currently all the surgeons you're sending are staying in the European hospital. I've seen a list of the number of plastic surgeons at the European hospital and neurosurgeons at the European hospital and orthopedic surgeons at the European hospital. It is flooded with surgeons because it's the only functioning hospital. And so unless the aid is balanced between providing the medication and the consumables that these doctors need and the operating rooms that these doctors need to be able to function, then adding more doctors is not going to solve the situation.
The stopping of UNRWA's funding, what is the impact of that on Gaza? We know probably the impact it will have on countries like Lebanon and so on. What is the impact on Gaza, the direct impact?
The only thing that was standing between malnutrition on a famine scale is UNRWA. And the decision to defund UNRWA 2 days after the International Court of Justice said that there's a plausible case to say that this is a genocidal war is really a declaration of the creation of an axis of genocide, because we know that if you defund UNRWA at the moment, the biggest humanitarian organization with almost 13,000 employees that is keeping people alive in Gaza at the moment, if you defund it and after March it has to stop activity, then you have basically you are attempting to wipe out the rest of the population.
Okay. One of the questions is, what do you think of a fostering system that connects orphans to parents who lost their children, that is supervised and financed by NGOs such as Taawon?
So for us, and I think this is the principle that Taawon has applied in the past and will continue, is that priority is given to keeping the child within the family, or at least within the extended family. If that is not possible, then you look further afield, but keep them within the community. Always supported, always the family that look after the child are supported, and child protection issues are monitored, are closely monitored, and the child is looked after, but kept within their community. Orphanages constitute the very last option available. And it's really the option that you have when you have no other options. My worry is that the severity of this war is that we will have severely wounded and disabled orphan children that we will need to have institutions dedicated purely to their care.
What about the disabled and the heavily wounded adults that will be unable to care for these children?
This is the other thing. We assume that if there's a parent or if there's an uncle or an aunt, they're capable of looking after them. But in a lot of places, because these extended families were targeted together while they were all in the same neighborhood or in the same house, these families were all injured together. And that's the devastating thing, is that the remaining adult in the family might actually need a care of their own.
Yeah. Who, in your opinion, will be the critical stakeholders in the reconstruction of Gaza? And what kind of support system should the international community forge to facilitate this?
What should be the critical stakeholders are the people of Gaza. The Palestinian people need to be the final arbiter of all services. They should lead on all of the services, and they should decide what services they need and what are the priorities. It is critical that the sovereignty of Palestinians over their lives is not a victim of this war, and therefore from health to social welfare, to education, to university education, school education, every aspect of Palestinian life, we have to respect Palestinian sovereignty over these sectors. It is critical. Unfortunately, just like these 25,000 children have been orphaned, 13 million Palestinians are orphaned with the death of the PLO. after in 76, after Tal al-Za'tar and the Tal al-Za'tar massacre, as a result of the large number of orphans that came out of the Tal al-Za'tar massacre, the PLO set up Atfal al-Sumud to look after these children. At the moment, there is no overarching Palestinian body that cares for these Palestinian, that will care for these Palestinian children. So it's critical that Palestinian civil society, working with the ministries in Gaza, to provide Palestinian leadership, Palestinian oversight, and Palestinian sovereignty over every decision that is made.
I don't know how. This is one question that popped up, but what will make the Western world interfere to stop the war? I don't know what fits after 123, 124 days, but what would, at the end of the day, make the Western world interfere to stop the war, especially on the healthcare system?
I think only the threat of regional instability will ever get the Western world to intervene. It is obvious. It is obvious. And you know, one of those things that every Palestinian knows, and everyone from the audience knows, if Israel had killed 13,000 puppies or kittens, the Western world's response would have been outrage and indignation. The fact that Israel killed 13,000 Palestinian Arab children, brown children, not white, blue-eyed, blonde children, meant that the world was able to tolerate this crime on a scale that had never been seen before. And so again, we go back to why Taawon is important. The master's tools will never bring down the master's house. We need our own tools. We need to set our own agenda. We need to provide our own care.
Dr. Ghassan, how can we contribute with the fund as urgent volunteers, not as doctors, to help transport love and take care of these affected children? Also, are these children allowed currently by Israel to leave Gaza?
So the number of children being allowed is nowhere near what we want to be allowed. In terms of volunteers, hopefully once we are up and running in Lebanon, there will be a critical component and a part to play for volunteers, both as individuals and as families, to support these children and their families on what can be a very isolating and bewildering treatment journey. And so it's critical that you know, people who can either help us through in Egypt while the kids are being transported through Egypt, or in Lebanon, you know, reach out to the foundation, and so that once we have these kids being treated, we are able to provide them with all that they need. And most importantly, solidarity. It is critical that people who have lived through this horror feel that there are others outside who are on their side, who care about them and who wish them well and who want to help. And it's so these acts of solidarity are as important and as important to the social and psychological well-being of these kids and their families as any mental health intervention.
Based on your insights, what do you envision for the future of Gaza, the day after? Now there's talk of a ceasefire.
So there are multiple scenarios. What the Israelis want is just a protracted no war, no peace situation where there's no reconstruction, there's no treatment of the wounded, and people are left to die of their wounds and then to leave, if not as a refugee problem, but as an illegal immigrant phenomenon. If there is a proper ceasefire and we are able to to impose the kind of ceasefire that we need to allow reconstruction, I foresee that the rebuilding of Gaza will become an act that will bring people together, because people have, for the last 120 days, been so frustrated with this need to help and to intervene. Once people have conduits and mechanisms by which they can intervene and help, then they will. It will take, I think, between 2 to 10 years for us to feel any tangible improvement in the quality of the lives of people in Gaza. But let's not forget, Gaza was destroyed during the First World War, and 30,000 of its inhabitants were killed. Gaza has been repeatedly destroyed throughout history, and rebuilding has been part of the resistance that has made Gaza the place that it is.
Considering the impact on the education infrastructure, what role does education play in the recovery process and be strengthened by organizations such as Taawon?
So the systematic destruction of over 300 schools, the carpet bombing of every single university, the targeting and assassination of university professors was an intentional attempt at destroying the education system that Israel knows occupies a very particular and special part in the psychology of the Palestinian people. Taawon can help by ensuring that once there is a ceasefire, innovative solutions are found to provide education at a school level and at the university level as early as possible through twinning with other universities and other schools outside, use of the technologies that we came to rely on during the COVID period. All of these things can be used, and Taawon can become a platform for leading the way on these things, and then other smaller organizations can add where they can help.
You've visited, you've been to many wars before. How would you describe this war? And do you think that this war needs to be documented properly?
So for me, the difference between every other war, and I've been to Mosul, and I've been to Iraq during the first Gulf War, and to Damascus during the Civil War, and all of Gaza's wars, is the difference between a tsunami and a flood. It looks the same, but the scale is so monumentally different that it just does not feel anywhere near the same. It is absolutely critical for multiple reasons that this war is properly documented, not just in the formal documentation, but in the ethnographic documentation of people's stories of bravery and heartache and resistance. And that's why the Institute for Palestine Studies has launched a project to document the destruction of the health system, to document this war. This is, one of Israel's ministers described this as Nakba 2. One of the problems that we had with trying to understand the first Nakba is that we relied on the archives of others. We now need, in this historical moment of genocide, to archive to produce our archives so that we never forget what has been done to us, who was complicit, and who stayed silent during this genocide.
Okay, our time is almost over. What would be your message to the Palestinians and to the world?
My message to the Palestinians is that as a Palestinian parent, I have never in my life been in fear for the future of my children as I have been in this war. Because I feel that regardless of where they are, regardless of what life choices they made, and I accepted when I was in Gaza the life choices that I made that had made me go to Gaza. But I believe that every Palestinian parent, wherever they are, whether in Chile or in the Gulf or in the States or in Jordan or in Lebanon, believe that the lives of their children are targeted by a genocidal Zionist project that now has decided to physically eliminate all Palestinians.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Ghassan. I hope this is over soon and the rebuilding of Gaza can start. And the Taawon orphanage program is a success. And the fund is, we can see children move to Beirut to be helped, rehabilitated, and taken care of. And as someone asked in the messages, loved and taken care of. Thank you everyone for joining. And thank you for your valuable time, Dr. Ghassan.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for their valuable time.